Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
There is a quiet rhythm humming beneath African American history, a spiritual cadence carried in voices, stories, and names, often overlooked, sometimes misunderstood, and rarely given the depth of exploration they deserve. It is a rhythm that does not begin on the shores of America, nor solely in the chains of enslavement, but much earlier, along the banks of the Nile, the hills of Ethiopia, the plains of West Africa, and ultimately, the ancient deserts of the Middle East. There lies a profound question that has lingered for centuries, but is only now coming into sharper focus. Why do so many African Americans, whether knowingly or unknowingly, carry names of Hebrew origin? Is it coincidence, cultural inheritance, or something far deeper rooted in history, migration, and spiritual identity? Beneath the veil of oppression and assimilation lies a powerful testimony encoded in names, revealing a legacy intertwined with that of the ancient Israelites. To begin uncovering this legacy, one must understand that names are not just labels in African or Semitic tradition. They are declarations, histories, and identities passed down through bloodlines and sacred memory. Among enslaved Africans brought to the Americas, a significant number hail from regions of West and Central Africa where Judaism, or practices similar to it, had long left their mark. Jewish traders, exiles, and converts had established communities across the Sahel, the Niger Delta, and even into the Kingdom of Congo centuries before the transatlantic slave trade began. These Jewish influences fused with local traditions, resulting in naming patterns and spiritual customs that bore uncanny resemblance to Hebrew rituals, such as circumcision on the eighth day, observance of dietary laws, and the use of biblical names. As Africans were transported to the New World, many retained fragments of these cultural practices, though often hidden or coded for survival. One such remnant lies in naming. Among enslaved populations, names were forcibly stripped away and replaced with European ones. Yet within enslaved communities, the oral tradition remained a vessel of resistance. African American naming conventions, especially in spiritual contexts like church records, gravestones, and family Bibles, continue to reflect Hebraic origins. Many African Americans adopted names like Elijah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Moses, Abraham, Levi, Isaac, and Malachi, not just from Christian familiarity, but because these names resonated with ancestral echoes. These were not arbitrary selections. Often, the individuals choosing them understood them to represent a people they identified with. The Hebrew prophet stories of exile, bondage, and liberation mirrored the Black experience in America so closely that the cultural adoption of such names became a symbolic declaration of shared destiny. Moreover, the emergence of African American religious movements in the 19th and 20th centuries further reinforced these connections. The rise of groups like the Church of God and Saints of Christ, founded in 1896 by William S. Crowdy, a former slave who claimed a vision calling African Americans back to their Hebrew heritage, brought new waves of Hebraic names into Black religious life. These groups believed that African Americans were descendants of the ancient Israelites, and as such should reclaim their biblical identities. In their congregations, Hebrew names were not simply religious, they were a reclamation of lost history. This movement intensified during the Harlem Renaissance and the early Civil Rights era, as many African Americans began exploring Afrocentric and biblical identities as a means of resistance to white supremacy. Influential leaders and musicians began adopting names like Obadiah, Shadrach, or Hezekiah, names that tied them both to Scripture and to a deeper spiritual heritage. The poetic genius of the Black community transformed these names into powerful symbols of resilience and sacred purpose. In the later 20th century, the rise of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement further brought Hebrew names into mainstream African American consciousness. This movement, which had roots in older religious traditions but gained significant momentum in cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, emphasized the belief that African Americans were the true descendants of the biblical Israelites. Many within the movement adopted Hebrew names, not as a rejection of America, but as an affirmation of a hidden identity long buried under centuries of forced acculturation. Names like Yahshua, Yitzhak, Jeremiah, and Ephraim became declarations of spiritual and historical continuity, not unlike how Malcolm X discarded his slave name and replaced it with a symbol of resistance and rebirth. It is important to note that even outside explicitly religious contexts, traces of Hebrew naming have persisted in subtle and often overlooked ways. In rural southern communities, family names and given names passed down for generations include obscure biblical references that don't appear in typical Christian usage, such as Asahel, Jedediah, or Tobiah. These names often arise in oral histories without clear church or missionary influence, suggesting a deeper ancestral familiarity. Furthermore, in African American folk practices such as hoodoo, which blends African spiritual traditions with biblical narratives, many practitioners invoked Hebrew names in prayer and incantation, names believed to hold divine power. This naming tradition even found its way into American pop culture, especially during the civil rights and Black Power eras. Soul and jazz musicians, writers, and thinkers increasingly embraced African and Hebrew names to assert cultural pride and spiritual independence. From Yahya Abdul-Mateen to Mos Def, later known as Yassine Bey, and from athletes like Eliezer Shabazz to community activists named Zikia or Micah, these names became part of a broader tapestry of re-Africanization and spiritual return. They were often expressions of not just faith, but defiance, an insistence that identity was not something to be dictated, but reclaimed. This interweaving of African American and Hebrew naming traditions cannot be fully understood without returning to Africa itself. In regions such as the Igbo lands of southeastern Nigeria, historical evidence suggests that certain clans practiced a form of Judaism prior to colonization. Anthropologists like Alauda Equiano and Joseph J. Williams recorded the presence of Jewish rituals among the Igbo, Ashanti, and other groups, rituals that included Sabbath observance, dietary codes, and Hebrew-sounding names. British missionaries and colonial administrators documented their surprise at hearing names and practices that echoed the Old Testament long before the Bible was widely distributed on the continent. This Hebraic legacy traveled with enslaved peoples and lived on in the names whispered in prayer, sung in sorrow songs, and etched into family lore. Today, as DNA studies increasingly reveal links between African Americans and regions of West Africa historically influenced by Jewish traders and exiles, a new generation is rediscovering these names, not as artifacts of biblical past, but as living bridges to ancestral memory. Hebrew names within African American culture are not accidental. They are fingerprints of an identity suppressed but never fully erased. From the silent power of a grandmother named Adasa to the dignified presence of a preacher called Eliezer, these names carry a truth buried beneath centuries of erasure. They speak to a people who, like the ancient Israelites, endured captivity, displacement, and suffering, but never forgot who they were. The revival of these names is more than a trend or religious shift. It is a spiritual reawakening. It is the sound of lost voices calling across time, echoing through names passed from generation to generation, asking the same question, do you remember who you are? In that remembering, history becomes more than a record. It becomes prophecy. And in the rediscovery of these names, African Americans are not only finding their past, they are reclaiming their birthright.